Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday. Yeah, it's Wednesday. Yeah, better be. So we're gonna continue learning where we left off. Now, last time we are learning, I think what we left off last time was like if somebody has to go to the hospital on Shabbos, the proper way of going, and things like that. And we are discussing the best way for somebody to go to the hospital, if you have a baby or anything else like that, would be to go with a non-Jewish driver, because then it's just minimal, much more, much less desecration of Shabbos. Because again, when you drive, there's brake lights and the lights and on and off and the gas and all that. Even if it's an electric car, it doesn't matter. So therefore, it's best to go with a non-Jewish person. They should open the car door, close the car door, take in the stuff to the car, take the stuff out of the car to the hospital. Once somebody is in a hospital, halachically you're allowed to carry. There's no problem carrying in a hospital. Now, I don't remember if we actually got to this part last week. What happens if somebody, we might have, what happens if somebody is discharged from the hospital on Shabbos or Yom Tov? You can have a two-day Yom Tov. Woman gives birth or somebody's in the hospital for various reasons. They're not going to keep it today. Hospitals don't keep you any extra time. So the question, what do you do? How do you get home? So again, if it's a patient that needs to go home on Shabbos I'm talking about, the ideal situation is the patient themselves could go home with a non-Jewish driver. Okay, they have to remember it's not the same saving a life. It's not the same pikuach nefesh as going to the hospital, but nevertheless, you still have to come home. A baby can't stay in the hospital. A person who's sick really needs the comfort of their own home. So therefore, ideally, they have to go home with a non-Jewish person. The question is, can somebody like the husband or a parent go home with a kid? Let's say a kid before Shabbos ended up in the emergency room, like it happens very often, and then they get the stitches or whatever, and then they need to go home. So again, one parent for sure can go home with the kid, because you can't have a little kid going home alone in a taxi or in a Uber. So there's no question that the one parent can go home. The question, could the second parent go home? Or if a wife has a baby, they're discharging her from the hospital, can the husband go back with the wife? So again, ideally, if he can walk home, if it's in walking distance, it's definitely much better that they should walk home rather than go home in the car. Because again, it's not really any more pikuach nefesh. It's not saving life. You're talking about going home. But there are poskim that say that if the wife needs the husband to go with her, or whatever, the patient needs somebody to go with them, then they're allowed to go back with them even on Shabbos. Yom Tov, obviously, to go home if it's not Shabbos is much easier, because the problem sitting at one of the many problems, but one of the main problems sitting in a car on Shabbos, if you're not driving, is the issue that you're adding weight. And by adding weight, you're causing more fuel or more electricity to become consumed. So the point is, though, that if it's only indirectly causing more fuel to become used, and Yom Tov, that's not a problem. Yom Tov, you can add to a fuel. You can add, make one fire from the next. So Yom Tov, for sure, the people that want to come home with the patient would be allowed to go home with the patient. And Shabbos, again, if they can avoid doing it, would be better. If not, there are opinions in halacha that say you can actually go home with the person on Shabbos. Another interesting question comes up. Many times people need to take shots on Shabbos, vaccines on Shabbos, whatever it may be, for various different reasons. Sometimes it's for infertility, sometimes, whatever it is. There's a lot of times people would have to take shots on Shabbos. So the question is, are you allowed to take a shot on Shabbos, a vaccine on Shabbos? So the answer is like this. If it's a life-endangering situation, if somebody needs a shot of insulin, you're not talking about that. But if it's a regular shot that somebody needs to take for whatever reason it may be, so the halacha is, if it doesn't bleed, always. In other words, if it's a shot that when you give it, you administer the shot, it always bleeds, That's a problem taking on Shabbos. Then the only way it would be able to be happen if a non-Jew gives you the shot. But for a Jew to give themselves a shot, or somebody in the family to give them a shot who's Jewish, so then if it always bleeds, so then you're causing bleeding on Shabbos, which is forbidden. Again, a Rav needs to be asked, because if it's something that's life-endangering situation or other things, there might be a lot of leniencies for that. I'm talking the general rule. If the shot doesn't bleed, then halachically you could take a shot on Shabbos. I mean, not stam for no reason. I mean, you could take a shot on Shabbos because, again, you're basically just taking some medication, but you're definitely not causing any bleeding. The main primary problem with taking shots on Shabbos would be the causing of the bleeding. Now, another question is, a blood test, person should not take a blood test unless if they're in the hospital. And let me, you know what, I'm going to jump the gun a little bit. I'm going to talk about this a little later. I'm going to talk about it now. The Rebbe once spoke a sicha, halacha sicha. And you have to get, when the Rebbe spoke the sicha, it wasn't as much outpatient like it is today. You know, in today's world, I can't say most, but a lot of procedures that people used to be in the hospital for 2-3 days or more, today is all done outpatient. But the Rebbe was speaking primarily surgeries where people stayed in the hospital. So the Rebbe came out with a halachic ruling, basically, that is preferred. He didn't say you're not allowed to. He said it's preferred not to have elective surgery Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. If you need elective surgery, it's preferable to have it Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. Why not Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday? There's a lot of din the Rebbe spoke there. Number one, the Rebbe said there's a din in Shulchan Aruch. It's a Gemara. It's brought down in Shulchan Aruch that you're not allowed to go on a boat, not today's cruise liners, but you're not allowed to go on a boat on Wednesday. Why? Because for the first 3 days, people used to get seasick. And then when you're coming into Shabbos, you're going to be miserable on Shabbos from being seasick. So the Gemara says, halacha, you're not supposed to go on a boat starting from Wednesday on, because it's within 3 days of Shabbos. Wednesday is already connected to Shabbos. And this morning, if you said the Hayom Yom, Revi b'Shabbos, at the end we say the small 3 psukim of L'chon Ranana, that the previous Rebbe called the kleina, the little mini L'chon Ranana. Why do we say it Wednesday? It's not really part of that Tillim. It's the next chapter, because Wednesday is already beginning Shabbos. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are connected to the upcoming Shabbos. So the Rebbe said when people do surgery, so as we all know, the first 3 days, you're out of it a little bit. You're not feeling well. So the Rebbe says if it's an elective surgery that you really could do you're not forced to do it Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. Why are you putting yourself in a predicament that you're going to be, you're not going to be feeling good on Shabbos? You're not going to feel well on Shabbos. So why do it? And then the Rebbe said there's 2 more points which are very, very interesting. The last thing the Rebbe said was that usually, as everybody knows in America, on the weekends, the real good doctors are off. That's because they have, seniority. So the good doctors are usually off during the weekends. So who do you have on the weekends? You have the new guys, the interns that are learning. So the Rebbe said, just think of it from a medical perspective. Why should somebody do a surgery and end up being in a hospital on Shabbos when you won't have the great care that you really could have if it's during the week? But then the Rebbe said another point, and this is a very important point that applies just to being in a hospital. And the Rebbe said the following. When a person's in a hospital, as we all know, they take a lot of tests that are really not that important. They do it routinely. I'll give you an example. A person in a hospital, every so often they take your temperature. Every few hours they take your blood pressure. and your oxygen level with that thing that goes on the finger. And they take blood. All these things. So if you're talking about a life endangering situation, the doctors need to do it, okay. But if they're just doing it because they really don't have to do it, they don't have to take your blood pressure every 15, 20 minutes in intensive care or every hour out of intensive care, whatever it is, because it's not something which is really important. And if you skip a few blood pressure tests, nothing's going to happen. So they do it out of routine. But the question is now, is that important enough that you should desecrate Shabbos? Now, even though the doctor is taking the test, let's say the doctor is taking the blood test, and don't forget, blood pressure tests today are not what they used to be, where they're all manual, push, and there was no digital writing and everything was manual. That blood pressure test wouldn't be a problem in Shabbos. It's only a question of measuring. And the bottom line is you're measuring for a case of illness that we learned you're allowed to. So the only question is, nowadays it's even worse, because nowadays the blood pressure tests are all digital. So even though you're not doing it, the nurse is doing it, but nevertheless, there's what's called misayea. You are helping them do it because you're sticking out your hand when they tell you stick out your hand. So you're helping them do something to you, which is really forbidden, and it's not necessarily medically needed. Again, if it's medically needed, it's a whole different story. But if they're doing it out of routine, it might not be necessary and meanwhile, you're desecrating Shabbos. And today we have a problem with another issue. Years ago, those of you older people in the room or on the Zoom would know that used to have mercury thermometers that the government banned because of who knows what. The mercury thermometers were not a problem using on Shabbos, because all it did, it measured your temperature, your fever. So again, measuring you don't just take your temperature because you're bored. You take your temperature because you're not feeling well. So then halachically measuring for somebody who's not well, halachically you're allowed to take temperature. So those were not a problem. By the way, there was a problem, halacha says, after you finish taking the temperature, those of you that remember, they used to shake down the thermometer to get it back low, that it would register the proper. That already poskim say you wouldn't be allowed to do even a mercury thermometer, because that's basically fixing something that you don't need now. You're fixing it, putting it back to make it workable versus leaving it where it was. So it's called makib patish, or preparing it for later, whatever. That might be an issue. The bigger problem today taking temperature is they're all digital today. Whether you do it on the forehead, in the ear, or it's not the same either rectal thermometer or oral thermometer that we grew up with. You take temperature today, it's all digital basically. So now the question is, are you allowed to take temperature if you take your temperature on Shabbos? You take because it's all digital, and basically then you're writing and all the other things with the various different types, or the one you do over your forehead or whatever it is. Then it becomes a big shaila on Shabbos. So if, let's say, God forbid, a kid is burning up, like the expression goes, a really high fever, and you need to know, it might be, God forbid, something that you would have to call the doctor, it might be life-endangering situation, then obviously you would be allowed to take the temperature, even though it's digital, because you're talking about a question of a possible, serious life-endangering situation. But if it's just you have a headache and you feel a little warm, it's a problematic halachically today to take temperature on Shabbos, because it's digital or whatever it is. It's still writing up, it's changing colors or whatever it may be. So that is another issue. That's why I jumped the gun with what he asked. What about a blood test? So same thing. I'm saying when you go into a hospital and they want to take a blood test, ideally on Shabbos, I know it's very difficult. You don't want to start fighting with the doctors and nurses, but you really have to ask them, is this necessary to begun my Sabbath? We're not supposed to be doing this. Can you avoid doing it? Or things like that. The same thing, I remember if we said when taking medication on Shabbos, if you have to take medication 3 times a day, let's say, and so if let's say it's especially during the summer days, okay, so then you could at least take 3 times the medication on Friday. Then you don't have to take it Friday night. Or if you have to take it 3 times on Shabbos, you try to take it maybe once on Shabbos, twice after Shabbos. Or if the day's long, you could take it maybe twice on Shabbos, once after Shabbos. We just can't do whatever we want just because. But again, halachically, if it needs to be done, you do it. And if it's even a doubt of life endangering situation, you have to do it. There's a response from Rabbi Yosef Feinstein, written a very long time ago, over 50 years ago. And again, times change medically also. What would be a very life endangering situation is not necessarily today considered life endangering. And somebody asked him in the tshuva, how much temperature, what fever is called life endangering that you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos? So he wrote for an adult 102. The Moshe Feinstein wrote that not a kid 102 it's not as dangerous as an adult. But he writes that an adult that has 102 fever is allowed to desecrate Shabbos because it's considered a life endangering situation. So again, all these things need to be kept in mind. What happens if somebody doesn't want to go to the doctor? They don't want to. Are you allowed to force them? Or a parent wants to go to the doctor, it needs to go to the doctor. So then you also have a shalit kibbud avayim, honoring your parents. But what happens? You have a parent that's stubborn; they don't want to go to the hospital, or they don't want to go to the doctor even during the week, let's say. But that they need to be seen by a doctor. So logically, you can force them to do it. A person is not, in fact, the poskim write this. A person is not allowed to refuse. Or even food that's treif, but the doctor says you must eat it. He's over the poskim right and shvichas damin. It's actually you might be transgressing, killing yourself, because if the doctor says you need to do it, you need to go to the doctor, and you're refusing, and you're trusting, and then you come along with religiosity. You say no, I trust in Hashem, I trust God, I trust God. So then. The story is, it says you lose your merits and they might not do a miracle for you. And if they do a miracle for you, because you're not going to the doctor, Hashem will cure you anyway. So then you lose your merits. 1 second, somebody asked a question. You're sick and have lost your appetite. No. Must you eat on Shabbos? No, you don't have to force yourself to eat on Shabbos. The eating on Shabbos, by the way, is supposed to be for enjoyment. I'm not talking about kids now, okay? But let's say on Shabbos, part of the Einik Shabbos, as we say in davening in Zmiris, what people say, Baser v'dagim v'chol matam. It says in Shulchan Aruch you should eat fish on Shabbos. You should eat meat or chicken on Shabbos. It says in Shulchan Aruch because those are normally foods people enjoy. So what happens if you have a person who hates fish, is allergic to fish? There are people that are allergic to fish, or they just can't tolerate fish. Okay? So then, I'm not talking about kids. Kids, it's a different story. But adults, then they shouldn't eat it. They shouldn't eat the fish. Yeah, very often, it's also a medical issue. Many people are allergic to grains. Many people today are allergic to wheat or barley or oats for that matter. And so what do they do with the meal on Shabbos? So they have to ask Taka Shaila. I mean, it is a Shaila and halacha because you have 2 issues. Number one, you have the meal of Shabbos that you're supposed to eat. There's a chiyuv, an obligation, a questionable rabbinic or biblical, but you have to eat a meal on Shabbos. Now, what happens if, and the meal's supposed to technically be hametzi, or at least mezainis. So what do you do if you're allergic to all these things? And then you have a second issue. What happens with kiddush? Kiddush has to be b'makom seuda. In order to be Eitz Kiddush, which is technically a biblical obligation, but if you verbally said it, then on the cup of wine it's rabbinic, you still have a rabbinic obligation to your Kiddush. And Kiddush must be in the place where you eat the meal. So therefore, again, they have to discuss it with the Rav. But then the issue, what needs to be done, is if they listen to Kiddush from somebody, let's say, and they drink a little bit of wine, or no wine for that matter, in order for them to be Yetz Kiddush in the place of a meal, they need to drink another 3 ounces, of wine or grape juice. That means if I need to make Kiddush and to be fulfilling the obligation of Kiddush, and I can't eat any grains, so I can't have any bread or cake or anything like that, what I must do is drink either another cup of wine or a cup of grape juice, 3 ounces minimum. Now, the guy that makes Kiddush has to drink 2 of those, basically. But somebody who heard Kiddush, as long as the guy that made Kiddush drank the cup of wine, all you have to do would be to drink a second cup of wine of drink a cup of wine and grape juice, 3 ounces. Now, if somebody can't handle that either, then they need to call it off. But coming back to answer the question, if somebody doesn't want to eat on Shabbos, they lost their appetite, they don't have to force themselves to eat on Shabbos. You're not allowed to fast on Shabbos. It's forbidden to fast on Shabbos. The only time a person is allowed to fast on Shabbos is Yom Kippur. Okay, that's the only fast, practically speaking, today that we fast on Shabbos would be Yom Kippur. Even Tisha B'Av gets pushed off. Or if somebody had a very bad dream Friday night, and there's a concept of fasting the next day, and it only works if you fast the next day. So then the Din in Shulchan Aruch says if somebody had a really bad dream that demands fasting, then you're allowed to fast on Shabbos. But because you fasted on Shabbos and you weren't supposed to fast on Shabbos, you have to fast another day during the week to make up for the fact that you fasted on Shabbos. That's how serious it is on Shabbos. So you don't have an appetite. People are sick sometimes, they just don't, but they should try to eat something. And again, they have the obligation of listening to Kiddush. There's a very interesting medrash they bring down over here in this book on issues of healing. They bring down a measure that Rabbi Shmuel, it's an interesting medrash. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva were walking outside Yerushalayim together with another person. And a sick person met them. So the 3 rabbis were walking and a sick person meets them. And he said, Rabbi Sai, how can I heal myself? So it's interesting. The Talmud, the Gemara is full of medication or process of how to heal, which today don't work, and you're not allowed to take them today. But in times of the Gemara, they did the Gemara says, for this thing you do this, and there's some weird things there too. But they say, for this you do this. So he said, how do I heal? So Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva said to him, take this and you'll get better. So the guy said to them, so the guy that was with them, the third guy, said, who made you sick? He said to the sick person, who made you sick? He said, Hashem. So he said to the rabbis, you are mixing into something that doesn't belong to you. Okay? Because God made me sick. Why are you mixing into God's business of trying to make me healthy when God made me sick? Why are you mixing into God's business? So they said to him, what do you do for a living? He said, I'm a farmer. I work the ground. And I even have the axe, the sickle in my hand. So the rabbi said to him, who created the ground and who created the vineyard? He said, God. So they said to him, and you're mixing into God's business, planting things there? Why are you planting things in God's business? It doesn't belong to you. Why are you mixing in? He says, well, I mean, because if I don't plant the field, nothing's going to happen. So they said, you're a fool. That's why Hashem says you have to heal yourself. So they bring down very strongly that if a person doesn't want to get a medical need, medical, attention, you can halachically you can even force them, because the person who is ill, again, not a headache, but a person who is seriously ill and refuses to go to a doctor is the poskim right, kilo shefach tam. It's like you're killing yourself. You're liable for murder. Okay. Now what happens? A few minutes left. What happens if you get different opinions from the doctors? One doctor says this, one doctor says this. So halacha talks about everything of this. Halacha talks about every aspect of a person's life. So halacha says, again, these are general rules because every time they're details. But if one doctor says this and one doctor says this, halacha is you ask, and this is what the Rebbe told a lot of people to do, what says in Shulchan Aruch. You ask a third opinion, and then you go by the majority opinion. That's what halacha says. You go by the majority opinion of doctors, not of everybody else in the family that knows everything. You have to listen to the doctors. If doctors disagree, then you need to get a third opinion. Generally speaking, especially by major medical things, and the Rebbe spoke about this many, many times, he said you should always get a second opinion. Always. Many times, the Rebbe also advised people they should speak to a Reife Yedid. You should speak to a doctor who's a friend. Because then they're more involved and they care more about it. Sometimes, many times, people say like this. One doctor says do surgery, one doctor says, no, let's not do surgery. And so ideally, you have to get a third opinion. Because then halachically, you do the majority of opinion. But the Rebbe also wanted that people should ask, let's say, a doctor who's a friend, not necessarily in that field, but a doctor who's a friend that because they know medicine and they know you and they really care about you, and it's not another number, so to speak. So their opinion would play an important role in making a decision. And of course, if halachic issues come up, you need to ask a Rav, what would be the halacha? Do I do it or don't I do it? People have to, it's always, halacha is always involved in these things. Then you have another question, one more question we'll discuss today. And that is, and this is, again, you need to speak to it off because there's a lot of emotional issues here and mental issues and a lot of things like that. A woman went into the hospital to have a baby. Okay, like we said, let's speak positive. She's having the baby on Shabbos. Halachically, can you have a non-Jew in the hospital call the house to say that they had a baby and what it was, a boy or girl, and who they look like, and all that stuff? Or somebody's in the hospital for whatever reason, for health reasons, and the family can't be their Shabbos, whatever, it's too far, and whatever, they need to be home, whatever the situation is. Is a guy allowed to call the home? Let's say you have an answering machine, because you can't pick up a phone, or sometimes you could, by the way, and I don't want to continue this too much because we'll get, Mitzvah next week we'll go into this, but it's very practical and very important halachically. What happens if I need to make a decision? Can they call me on Shabbos? Can I pick up the phone to make a decision? So Mitzvah next week to be continued. Now we're going to go to Tanya.